Intensity again, psychic automaton and the unconscious as the virtual halo on the periphery of attention and recognition. Bergson Matter and Memory and his Histoire des théories de la mémoire at the Collège de France, 1903-4. In these illuminating texts, we find the theory of automata at the center of Bergson's metaphysical psychology, and with it, profound notions of the unconscious, the being of the past, and the limits of spirit and mind. All the themes of memory revolve around the problem of memory. First, intensity is not quantifiable. Sensation is never a mere degree of difference, but is always accompanied by qualitative differences, and every value is a vector and average rather than a measured quantity. Intensity of sensation is irreducible to the quantity of a stimuli, and since complex feelings are not mere assemblages of sense intensities, but since these coexist with psychical automata and voluntary attention. Time and free will concluded that a psychical intensity is a felt reality that is unstable, qualitatively dynamic, and every intensity has a unique sui generis nuance and has some vague relation to all other psychical states. Second, intensity cannot explain the difference between perception and memory, kind rather than degree. Here, intensity is used in a purely analytic sense. Elsewhere, the term is used in its integral sense, as within its movement, in the making, the duration. Intensity is then a kaleidoscopic image organized organismically and evolving in its prolongations. Analysis has inertia propelling consciousness into matter, turning us eventually into psychical automata. When we have insisted on a memory or one has come involuntarily, it also endures automatically and against our efforts to escape it. Memory gathering is an intensification, building momentum of attention and concentration. This gathering is not a mere accumulation, but involves a heterogeneous continuity of psychological facts, a series of kaleidoscopic evolutions. The tension of duration grows with prolongation as more of the past is held in tension, and intensity is all about multiplicity, but a multiplicity that is able to be taken as a whole in several ways that are equivocal. Habit is the persistent example. It is poison and cure, blessing and curse, virtue and vice. Music is even more multiformed. It wakes us and puts us to sleep, comes in countless genres with more on the horizon, and hides in our every physiognomy, e.g., melody and rhythm of voice in spoken word, style in writing and gesture, grace of movement or social graces, sympathy and politeness. Passion of philosophy is a gradually intensifying process of novel integration in the mind, whereby the conscious mind draws more from integral memory than it contains through the organismic whole that it evolves. The élan vital is the most multiformed layer of all existence. The energy and flexibility of life manifest in so many divergent lines of evolution, in play between torpidity and mobility, plant and animal, instinct and intuition. It is the whole of memory in its multiform manifestations. All life involves the spark of feeling in memory, but does not always rise into consciousness. There is an enduring psychological state that is nascent or preparing movement, which begins to sketch the future. Plants are always asleep and only minutely able to perceive and move towards light as someone sleeping rolls over to fall back asleep. Perception is almost awakened, a nascent perception, an irritated sleeper, rising in intensity but not producing experience. The continuous development of sensory motor systems has formed the most remarkable diversity of phenotypes that paleontology and zoology offer endless wonders in the movement and behavior of animals. Animals have recognition and some, perhaps many memories, but they do not, Bergson thinks, freely sift through and open them to novel cultivation and invention. To recap, the key moments of existence in Bergson: habit, music, élan vital, etc. These are so many ways of forming a plane of consciousness that contracts the whole of our past experience in a unique way, with an intensity that is concrete to the actual lived multiplicity. An intensity, in the Bergsonian sense, always involves a multiplicity of tendencies. It contracts our whole past in unique ways, so that a kaleidoscopic change to the whole recurs over an undivided continuity that is infinitely divisible retrospectively, as if viewing what we live firsthand, movement, in the eyes of someone else looking at us. We externalize ourselves in conforming to society, we ingrain the automatisms of our culture, economic, and historical context. Intensity of consciousness is not only cashed out in greater and less quantities of action. A greater multiplicity and complexity of actions will facilitate consciousness and reflection. But intensity of consciousness is seen as much in restraint as it is on enacting one's will. Intensity has to do with the tone of consciousness, the forces stimulating and steering our attention, the unfolding of clouds of virtual images on the periphery of consciousness. The many suggestions of relevant associations crowding each thought, nascent images and movements that only need to be prepared for actualization but are not fully activated or experienced. Our disabilities are equally as profound as our abilities, and it's in the bittersweet tone of tragedy, blues, and folk music that intuitive and profound sentiment removes and its kin, grief, indignation, and courageous defense. These emotional, them say, are woven into the passion of philosophy itself and contribute to its depth and elevation. Intensity of consciousness is, in every case, a perspective on the whole, a monad, a unique way of putting it all together. Pure memory is fully virtual, ineffectual, like a virtue that is not activated in sleep, but it continues to exist. It has an infinitely small weight and can gain mass by contractions in consciousness that the memories themselves cannot accomplish. The body must rise up with movements to have the souls of Plotinus descent and embody their spirit. There is a magic in bodies that, like an incantation, makes them imitate life before it emerges. And when the complex organizations have been archived, the soul unique to this context of life actually lives. Presumably, their virtual souls are infinite and can always accommodate a transformation. These virtual souls are not mythic archetypes, but our own memories exist in this way. They have an automatic character. They seek realization, but are powerless. Perhaps it's best to think that they gain a want, they begin to seek actualization, only after some convergence, some bringing together in consciousness or in sensory motor systems, or what is in fact always at once, movement, sensation, perception, memory, feeling, and interpretation. We can go from memory to sensation, and this has a sort of gradual quality to it, where it's hard to say what is memory and what is sensation, but memories are not therefore weak sensations. How do we jump the gap from an ineffective virtual being to an actual sensation becoming? Intensity in the hypnotic suggestive state. Feeling cold in a hot room by mere suggestion. The feeling does not start as a perception. It is not the result of an alteration of our body. Memory of the past is like the suggestion of a hypnotist. The intensity builds by our leaning on the past, insisting on the memory. The past leaning on out present, reciprocally sustaining and deepening our attention. The hypnotized is unconvinced of the situation, and memory does the rest. But then the body actually responds and shivers, even turns blue. We can indeed, in several ways, go from weak imaginative suggestion to an almost fully realized. Memories do not merely associate, call on each other. They suggest each other. They implant a command that we execute automatically to keep the train of thought moving. Fleeting thoughts coalesce. These suggestions can also move via metaphors and images, and lead to deep existential reflection, as much as poetic expression of being here, being human, trying to understand ourselves together. The hypnotism works because the psyche forms a community with itself, and there is a democratic process of integrating suggestions. We learn to ignore the call of certain desires and entrench ourselves in habits and character, which both limits the scope of our actions and movements, focuses them on what we value, orients our behavior and projects. The path there is paved by the inertia of a series of nascent suggestions. The carrot on the stick that we dilate with our whole being as we dedicate ourselves to something like grad school, a career, a relationship, or apprenticeship. There is hardly ever a single object motivating us. At this level, all our tendencies are at work, and all that matters is that enough of them are converging. The contours of the watershed of a converging tendency is mapped by our past experience, although it is not traced explicitly in consciousness, but is filled out by our anticipation and its halo of almost present images and prepared movements, about to leap, about to start running. A vast landscape of meaning opens before us with respect to nascent movements, but we live them and don't notice the pattern of suggestion that structures our experience. The sensory motor schema are lending themselves to an imaginative effort of sketching our perceived world, drawing out of it what can prepare movements in such a way as to adapt to a sui generis form. Dynamic schema is the imperfect beginning of the reconstitution of the perceived, quasi-conscious anticipation of enactment. You cannot instantly put yourself in a train of thought if you weren't already thinking about something closely related to some thread of what you intended to start thinking. Anticipation is the momentum of thought, and this needs to be fostered before we will accept the suggestions and follow the train. We need time to develop and intensify the images. How does it happen? It's something like the embryo dividing and expanding through a continuous integration and repurposing. The mind awakens as memory becomes more activated, as the virtual is gradually let to live a second life, a life of reverberations that are affectionate with or adverse to the movement we embody. There's always a difference between matter and memory because there is a difference between the present and the past, between becoming and being. The mind-body problem is only an unsolved mystery of metaphysics, so long as we have not fully noticed the utilitarian side of consciousness and restated the problem in terms of time. Intensity of effort at introspection. Much is discovered and given voice to, mute being, but not all. Unconscious forces lay in the shadows, inaccessible to observation. The tendency in general, whether instinct or passion, is known only in its effect. He causes is beyond observation. Some psychological states are too fleeting to become conscious. Intensity is a prolongation that transforms kaleidoscopically. But it is not a continuous thread. Rather, we will struggle to integrate one plane with another. Habit has left a sedimentation that is not easily disrupted, and against our conscious will, it pulls the reins. We feel alienated in certain contexts and accepted in others, and these are separated by a marked tone, very difficult to square them in the same consciousness. Without fragmenting the self, which has a virtual unity, is only actualized by fragmenting itself, insisting on a certain part of itself, some of its tendencies, and repressing others. This is what passion is, channeling energy so that it develops depth and elevation. So our embodiment, sensory-motor organism that is irreducible to the instant, is the site of anticipations and encounters with the unknown. The path is shaped by habit, which structures the salient motor responses.
When we perceive an object, particularly a familiar one, we often have an accompanying tendency to use it in a certain way. Habit has set up a series of mechanisms that are ready to be triggered. As we perceive the object, we have a tendency to use it in a specific way, and all these pre-established mechanisms associated with the object's use are poised to activate. Although this activation usually does not occur unless we actually use the object, the potential for activation is still there with a tendency to manifest. This tendency of certain mechanisms to come into play to utilize the perceived object likely contributes significantly to the feeling of recognition. Most of the time, we move automatically among familiar objects. For example, we know the apartment where we live. It feels familiar to us. We know it as well as one can know something. What does this mean? It means that when we enter the apartment, from the moment we step inside, we move about the rooms almost automatically, without needing to ask ourselves any questions. This recognition is, so to speak, pre-programmed into our bodies, represented by motor mechanisms that trigger when the appropriate opportunity arises. Most often, we are unaware of this. If you were to ask me, for instance, whether the door to my room opens inward or outward, I might not be able to tell you. But suppose, in my absence, a worker accidentally reverses the direction in which the door opens. If it originally opened inward and now opens outward, when I try to open it, I will undoubtedly be surprised. My mind will not be surprised because I wasn't consciously aware of it, but my body will be. Therefore, my body knew. It had this knowledge imprinted, so to speak, in the form of a mechanism ready to be triggered when given the chance. Even when the trigger does not occur, the tendency remains.
January 22nd, 1904. Bergson would not be satisfied with pure automatic art, which would relinquish the effort of invention. It would leave us to our habits, and likely more to the superficial, an unintegrated burst of energy. Expression must be more than a hose that we let go of and which flails around. Indeed, this metaphor is already assuming a frozen image of movement, not the moving, a projection of movement into a diagram, not traced dynamically, but fixed objectively. The hose is fixed to the faucet and works as a highly regulated system fixed in its perimeters of stability. This is a very limited system of expression, like spraying the primary colors on a canvas. You can only do this so many times until its aesthetic value shows itself to be meaningful only to concepts in theory or as a shock value. But it hardly forms a genre of unlimited expression, like refined style, even if time, and measure intellect capital, always swallows the authenticity of any genre, so that style of expression is historically embedded and not free from all automatisms. That's society talking. The inauthentic is not merely a normative concept being forced on us by an unjust power structure. This is, of course, a factor. But there is also an immanent sense that is vitiated by the multiplicity of becoming, insofar as it has more potential than power, more unknown beyond itself than what it contains in a prefigured anticipatory already. There is an automated form of politeness, as there are forms of misogyny, sexism, racism, and even of aesthetics pleasures, humor, and even the horizon of futurality has been prefigured by the automatic conformity of custom. Habit is blessing and curse, tool and weapon. According to Bergson, there are two kinds of form in existence: automata and organisms, and the latter is not without the former, and the former is a figure that emerges from the latter as a background. Inertia is born from momentum, and momentum is something that builds or diminishes. Cast from our mind the ponderance that starts with rest, solidity, presence, and then attempts to make movement, liquidity, and context emerge from them. Motion cannot come from the points in space that it traces. Movement is an integral reality with interiority and something like a sleeping nascent consciousness. The momentum-building energy in duration, which not only increases its force in one action, but varies its direction and context, adding new possibilities gradually over duration, gathers its halo of nascent preparations. This is what Bergson called the élan vital. The memory. A definite article makes it impersonal, and a memory of the universe is not lost to the élan vital in us all. Do we say this like a robot, the dummy of an automatic ventriloquist that unconsciously pulls our strings? Are we machines of the universe or individuals expressing ourselves freely? Grace appears between the periods of regulation of motion. Time hands us back what becoming denies us when it involves itself in itself from outside and within. Resonance grows. We do some self-hypnosis from different angles, channeling the flows into the canyons of our sensory motor landscape. We form a passion by manipulating the weather patterns, but they draw their force from a distant ocean. The cone has not top. It extends into the past of all pasts, and outside of all outsides. The unthinkable beyond that is affirmed by experience, reason, and inspiration. Recognition.
In such cases, the feeling of recognition seems to be nothing other than this feeling of automatism. This sense we have of our automatism, rising from the lower sphere of movements to the higher sphere of perception. This automatism is thus a movement, and our feeling of automatism is the sensation that accompanies the movements or the tendency toward movements. But this sensation, ascending from the realm of movement to that of perception, imparts the mark of recognition and familiarity to those perceptions. Hence, I conclude that in many cases, the sense of familiarity or déjà vu is nothing more than the feeling that the seen object or the heard thing would naturally, and almost necessarily, continue through certain complex motor reactions. Reactions already prepared in our body, awaiting only an occasion to trigger. This sensation of a well-ordered motor accompaniment is, in many cases, the basis of the feeling of recognition. Perhaps, in some instances of abnormal or quasi-pathological recognition, the feeling of recognition arises from the same source.
January 22, 1904. Our recognitions are automated in two different ways. Both must work together. First, by the nascent sensory motor schema that is at work sketching motor diagrams. Second, by the memory which inscribes the recognized in a context that makes sense of its appearance. I see something across the room sitting almost entirely out of view. I see the edge of this thin, flat black plastic thing and immediately think it is a step stool and begin to wonder how it got there, but can't for the life of me recall why I would have brought it into the room. All of a sudden, and this has all happened in 3 of 4 seconds at most, I notice that this is my old laptop, not the step stool. Without thinking about it, I also remember why I put the laptop there and that I had knocked it over while putting it there. And again, the feeling when it fell and my reaction. Good thing I backed everything up off that. This all comes packed together in an additional 2 seconds. I then immediately reflect that this is an example of recognition at work in its failure. The acquired but expressive motor diagram is exploited by a memory that is similar enough for me to take it this way and move on, crucially not letting myself attend to it in any more detail, which would have immediately shown the difference between the stool and the laptop. From the start, it was memory that was developing intensity. In this case, thoughts and their halo of memories spiral off, and sensation and perception were abandoned. The thought grew by blocking out, and when it had run its course, the trance ended. I was standing before a laptop, and my thoughts appear as futile consequences of a misrecognition in which memories were given an undeserved power. The phenomena of false recognition, extreme déjà vu, where the entire scene plays out as an inevitable drive, an unstoppable force, an irresistible inertia.
I mentioned an observation that was communicated to me, where the subject, suffering false recognition, offers a curious insight. They claim that what dominates their experience during the entire illusion is a feeling of familiarity, inevitability, as though they were mechanically witnessing the unfolding of something unstoppable by any divine or human force. It seems, then, that the subject experiencing paramnesia feels a sense of automatism. They are not acting automatically, but it seems that the sensation of automatism occurs, and that it is sufficient to have this general feeling of automatism. This sensation of automatism, rising from the sphere of activity to that of intelligence, marks all observed events and perceived things with the stamp of recognition. I believe this observation applies to many cases. You might ask, what is this sensation of automatism? What exactly is this feeling of automatism that suddenly arises? It could simply be a state of diminished willpower.
January 22nd, 1904. The will as the guiding of our memory, as what modulates our plane of consciousness and what can resist the actualization of tendencies, ultimately our concrete self, is not an automatism. Taine thought that memories are all automatically attempting to realize themselves. Each has an infinitely small actualization, and they all struggle and fight against each other to gain intensity and become a perception, or as close to a perception as possible. The self and choice play no role. Consciousness does nothing. It's incontestable that memories can gradually approach becoming hallucinations, even sensation and attenuated perception. When attention insists on a memory, it is intensified in concentration, and yet also expanded into a heterogeneous mass of nascent movements, memories, feelings, etc. Hypnotically suggested hallucinations are not able to be explained in mechanical causality. The suggestion, the summons, the dilation of consciousness, as it anticipates its arrival in a memory, preparing movements, none of these is devoid of the tension and concentration of consciousness with its sui generis tone. The planes of consciousness are what allow such rapid expansion of memory and thought. Intensity is expanding and contracting multiplicities of psychical facts, integral moments, enveloping infinities in a heterogeneous continuity. Consciousness is an energy that connects the inactive with pure act. Consciousness is not open only to the present becoming. It is open to the past. It is open to virtual objects, tendencies, unconscious automata.
We are told that memory is a nascent perception, a weaker perception, for the very simple reason that if one intensifies the memory, one eventually obtains a hallucination. Our response is, everything would happen in the same way if the memory, instead of being a weaker perception, was something entirely different, unrelated to perception, something that relates to perception as hypnotic suggestion, or the hypnotist's words relate to the suggested state. For in that case, if one insisted on this memory, which is comparable to hypnotic suggestion, as the hypnotist insists with the subject, one would obtain a stronger and stronger sensation and eventually a fully hallucinatory sensation. Everything would happen as Taine describes, yet the mechanism would be entirely different. And between perception and memory, there would be a difference not of degree but of nature. December 18th, 1903. By intensifying memory, one tends toward perception, but by diminishing the intensity of perception, one does not tend toward memory at all.
Ibid. Contratains, updated from Hume, view on intensity, that perception and memory are different intensities of the same reality. Bergson shows is incoherent, and that his own descriptions preserves all Taine's descriptions and evidence, and can explain why perceptions do not become memories by decreasing their intensity. Memory works by spreading out in multiplicities, and this can intensify by being lived in the embodiment of an intuition, in an expression that breathes life into our thought, lifting it to make our own effort. This will have its seat in our deep past, the unschematizable complexity of concrete life. But the poet does give something like an intuition, a building us of thought in meditation, occasioned by a series of images. This is such a remarkable passage that it warrants quoting it in full.
It is from visual objects that we borrow most of our images. Comparisons that have no relation to one another, since they are very different images being evoked. Yet, there is always the same mental direction. We evoke, in a certain mental direction, images that represent this direction, even though they bear no relation to each other. Take, for instance, something I came across by chance when opening an anthology, a collection of selected works. I was looking for an example from poets at random, and I found a stanza from Lamartine concerning the dying soul casting one final glance behind. The poet says that the soul regrets life, and according to the poet, it is wrong to do so. There are 3 or 4 images that follow each other, without any connection between them as images. Here is what we read. The lyre, in breaking, sends forth a more sublime sound. The lamp that suddenly goes out rekindles itself, and shines with a purer light before expiring. The swan sees the sky at its final hour. Man alone, turning his gaze backward, counts his days only to weep over them. These 3 images have no connection with each other. Moreover, I am not sure that a lyre, in breaking, sends forth a more sublime sound, nor even that a swan's song is very pleasant to hear. But let's compare these 3 images. They have nothing in common. A lyre does not resemble a swan, nor even a lamp, let alone a lamp that goes out and rekindles itself. What do all these things have in common? It is certain that the poet could have found many other images to express this thought. One would find other examples in Victor Hugo, and even more striking ones. What is common to these images? It is a mental direction, and it is a mental direction of which one can become aware. Anyone who searches for images, and one cannot write without searching for images, realizes quite well that one does not move from one image to another image. If Lamartine had started with the lyre and then asked himself, now, what shall I turn to? He would never have found the swan, nor the other images that presented themselves to his mind. That much is certain. But there was a certain abstract direction. How shall I put it? The direction of something that exalts itself before ending. We first have the idea of something finishing, and necessarily that something must exalt itself as it finishes. Nature shows us that what is about to end exalts itself, and even then, when I say what is about to end exalts itself, I am already using an image. The memory is already rendered into an image. But in any case, this direction, once followed, leads to other images. It is as if a soul is seeking a body, if you will, and then materializes in images. I believe that anyone who engages in such an exercise, who conducts research of this kind, will often realize that they are close to the image. They are about to find it, but they do not quite reach it. They feel that they are about to grasp it, that it is there, yet the unconscious process will indicate the image, then move past it, and they will not succeed in finding it. Thus, it is by no means a passage from one image to another image. It is the passage of the mind from a state that bears no resemblance to the representation of images, to an image that forms itself. I repeat, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to describe such a phenomenon, but I believe that, with these hints, anyone who reflects on this for themselves will eventually give themselves an intuition of what I would call pure memory, which resides at the border, at the limit between the conscious and the unconscious.
Ibid. The dynamism of consciousness lives on the border of presence and absence, or of invisible values, virtual and nascent movements, directions that are not reducible to what is oriented by them. Diverse and various images are evoked one after another, and a hidden melody sings through them that is like their style or secret. The threads form a multiplicity of latent liaison among a multiplicity of remembered psychical states. These are not collections of molecular units, data points, or information. It is a cloud of feelings, becomings, transitions, transformations.
With one point or several juxtaposed points, one will never create mobility. It is the same in every domain. Thus, in psychology, the dynamic memory, the one that truly acts, the one that will act in mental life, is something entirely different from the image, which is in a way its terminal point. Locate a memory by managing to place it between two other memories that will serve as landmarks. This implies that we know which memory to choose. I have a memory to locate in the past. I will find two memories or multiple memories between which it is placed. How will I find these memories if at the time when I carry out this operation, the intercalation operation of which Taine speaks, if at that time the localization is not already done, or almost done, or virtually done, 38? That to express the localization, to express it to others, and even to express it to myself, to arrive at having an expressible, communicable idea of it, I proceed as follows. This is not doubtful, but only the moment I do so, I am already on the way to the solution, and even that the solution has already been found, this does not seem to me doubtful either. What does it mean? To locate a memory. So let's appeal to the deep feeling that we call intuition, and try to internalize our memory, instead of looking at it from the outside and doing an analysis. When I internalize a memory, here is what I find. This memory generally has a mark of its own, if it is localizable. It has as the mark of the period to which it belongs. This brand is a je ne sais quoi that I could not express in words, but that we all feel. The different periods of our existence appear to us differently, with a special colouring and nuance. When we go to review places where we lived in the past, a very long time ago, we feel very good when we see them, that in the past there was, besides what we now see, something else, a nuance, a je ne sais quoi, which was added, a halo, if you will, which surrounded the spectacle, a fringe. We look for this fringe in what we see, and we no longer find it. We realize very well that if we could find it, we would be transported to the past. We would relive our past. The more we search, the less we find, because what we see, the clear outline of what we see, prevents this kind of sui generis impression from reproducing. This is what explains to us that when we go to see places again with the idea of reliving what we lived there, we experience a disappointment. And we find that it was much better to stay in the memory, in the pure dream. We were much closer to the same thing than when we are facing this thing. So, there is a je ne sais quoi characteristic of the past. Something simple, indivisible. To locate a memory of such a period, what do? We take a simple impression. We try to refract it, divide it, scatter it. By taking certain indivisible points that we're going to seek very high above a certain plane, we gradually lead them by a series of refractions to divide, to superimpose on a certain plane 39. It's on this plane that Taine will take the memory. It shows us that such a determined memory is interspersed between two other memories taken on the same plane. And this is true, but by this time the scattering is already done. Most of the localization is done. So the real process of localization is not something mechanical, like what I described. This is not the process of intercalation, of juxtaposition. It's a process that is much more like a biological process. To the segmentation of an ovum 40, the ovum segments, divides indefinitely so as to go through all the phases of embryonic life. This is intuition. The period is divided, segmented into memories that scatter, and which then constitute a development on a plane of all the events that filled this period. The localization thus carried out, we can only realize it by putting ourselves inside the process by intuition. So it's not analysis, it's intuition. What usually prevents us from seeing how things are going? It is that we are not made to observe in this way. We are made to take results, to follow the operation itself of memories which took shape, which became aware, which are scattered on the plane of which I spoke earlier. That is all done, but in doing so, the movement by which it will be dispersed, we are not made to perceive it. It takes an unnatural effort to get there. Therefore, it is an effort of a rather philosophical nature. It is not an effort in the direction of usual and scientific knowledge.
Association as automatic thought. I cannot help recognizing things. I am like Plato's prisoner in a cave, captivated by identifying the shadows on the wall. When I see anything that can be identified, I do so without making any effort. I am bound to my recognition like a vice or addiction, where one reaches for cigarettes or walks to the liquor cabinet without thinking and finds themselves already in the act before the mind can consent or restrain. Analysis is a useful addiction that can become a serious problem. The attention to life builds momentum and becomes an unstoppable force of action. Action will often shun emotion, sympathy, and constructive critical self-reflection. The energy of utility and the greed for gaining greater advantage becomes exploitative, taking, stealing, and exterminating. There is an automatism of colonialism that is strengthened by economic and political forces on every level and has prepared the path of least resistance in a meaningless, alienated complacency. Deaden the senses of the masses and control them by manipulating desires. Subliminal messaging is only a recent corrective on a long history of power distorting our awareness, worldview, attention, directing our sense of urgency, or stoking and choking our sense of grief and indignation. Ruling classes have been doing it for millennia. Religious indoctrination and nationalisms do the same. Association and habit are inextricable from all these larger threads of history and morality. The first law of association is that everything has some similarity or contiguity. No association is impossible. Character and passion have more to do with the associations than similarity or contiguity. This is the same as explaining a piece of music by these mechanisms of association. Why does this particular note follow his other one and not a different one? The answer will point to a plane of consciousness, contracting, focusing, with its tension and tonality, rather than to a content of consciousness being related to another as compared units of information. The grow of consciousness achieved is by turning the kaleidoscope, enacting new expressions, and refining them. The intensity is both new and old, growing by leaving behind and expanding, but also sustaining and transforming. These verbs stand across past and present. They speak to a coexistence of past and present that is enigmatic and, when felt, is a truly sublime and magnificent intuition of not only a type of being, spiritual, sensitive, expressive, etc., but also of a way of life. This way of life involves a passion, a calling, that of the philosopher's vocation. Science aims at improving our knowledge of physical systems. Philosophy aims at making ourselves into a new kind of being that thinks in a new way, to create a new way of knowing, intuition. Intuition is not a single preformed thing. It is a spirit of invention that is concrete. It unfolds aesthetic, social, sympathetic, and habitual factors. But the novelty is beyond automata. It's consciousness waking up and swerving the atoms. This metaphor is inadequate because it makes the guiding external to the atoms that swerve, and because the swerving centers of memory, channeling and intensifying, are not between stops along a journey, but are only represented that way to make it easier to think through it. The swerving is orchestrated through resonant suggestions and the kaleidoscopic integration of multiplicities of nascent memories. Under the starry sky of an infinite past, our freedom consists in bearing witness to the past and inciting on it, rather than automata at work. We have an inventive consciousness engaging with matter creatively.
Here is one last quote from January 29th, 1094. Let's take a very simple example, the same one we discussed earlier, the example of recognizing a chair. First, there is the recognition of the chair that is more enacted than thought or represented. It consists, upon seeing the chair, in performing or at least preparing or sketching with the arms and legs the movements of using the chair. This is entirely mechanical recognition, the same kind of recognition that an animal might have of a familiar object. So, at the lowest level, we place the memory that consists in actions, or rather motor reactions, already pre-programmed in the organism and suited to their object. It would be useful to draw a diagram on the board. If we want to represent this as a point, because it is something very narrow, let's call this point. Let's choose a letter to signify it. And since we are talking about movement and mechanism, we'll call it M. So there is a point M where motor memory is localized, memory in its narrowest and most frequent form. Now, above this memory, which consists simply of organized motor reactions, above this point representing memory in its narrowest form, we will place, if you like, what we will call schematic memory, the dynamic schema accompanied by the images that might help to illuminate it. I just took the example of a chair being recognized. The point M represents memory in its mechanical form, and above that, we have the collection of memories and images of chairs in general, with, in particular, the schema, the virtual outline of a chair's design. This dynamic schema, accompanied by past images that are ready to be localized, should be represented by something much broader, infinitely broader, by a circle, for example. Here it is illustrated. Let's call it, for the sake of clarity, S and S prime. On the right side, if you like, there will be the dynamic schema, the emerging outline of the chair, the possibility of drawing it, which helps us recognize it when we focus our attention on it. Then, at S, there will be images of the chair, fleeting images of which the schema is the summary. This schema is, in a way, the generative law of the chair's form, a law that summarizes the individual images of chairs. Where there is a schema, we can always, with a little effort, retrieve the images, although it is not necessary for them to be present. They exist there virtually. Now, above S and S prime, we will add something else. We must imagine that in addition to these image memories and the schema on the plane, SS prime, there is, much higher and further back, another plane, which we will call RR prime. It is on this plane, R prime, that all personal memories localized in our past would be arranged. If we are talking about a chair, for instance, the memory of a specific chair we know, which is tied to our personal history. All these memories relate to different points in the past and would be located on this plane, R prime. They exist there in an unconscious, virtual state, and although they could be brought to consciousness, in general, they do not appear. In summary, we could say that memory comprises, at point M, all memories that consist of sketched or nascent movements, mechanical motor memories or motor tendencies. It also comprises, at SS, dynamic schemas and impersonal image memories, and then, much further beyond, at RR, personal images that are part of our personal history, localized in our past experience. And then, if we want to represent the totality of memory, we must draw a cone from point M to the circle RR prime, with R minus R prime as the base and M as the tip. The solid shape formed by M, SS and R minus R prime, this inverted cone, would give us the model we propose to represent memory. It would be a solid with a wide base, almost infinite, and an extremely narrow tip, almost a mathematical point, a sort of cone, but nevertheless a solid. I emphasize this point. It is a kind of solid. This is important, because this model, I believe, clearly distinguishes our conception of memory from most of the other conceptions we will review. You will see that they all agree that memory should not be considered as a solid, but as a surface. Let me explain. Most theories agree that all memories exist on the same plane and differ only in complexity. One memory is more complicated than another, and that's the entire difference. If our model is correct, there would not only be differences in complexity, but also differences in quality, in spatial position, in the planes of memory. Memory has different planes. I will return to this in the next lesson, because it is an essential point that I cannot fully explain here in passing. I just want to highlight this key point. Current theories place all memories on the same plane because they adopt an essentially atomistic conception of the life of the mind. They start from the idea that psychological states are like atoms, that psychological states seem to be so many atoms that aggregate and disaggregate with each other, and that psychological states differ from one another only by the degree of composition or complexity. There is no absolute difference in nature between memories, only differences in the degree of complexity. If we dig deeper into this theory, we find that it is initially inspired by an a priori view, a comparison between the mind and matter, between consciousness, if you will, and the unconscious. And then, finally, and this is the only point I want to emphasize now, this theory rests on the idea that all memories have the same origin and are acquired in the same way. That's the crux of the matter. The belief that all memories have the same origin and that all memories are acquired mechanically. Open a standard psychology textbook, a simplified one because things must be simplified, but in general you will find this view that all memories are acquired in the same way, acquired. This is almost a truism, through the repetition of a movement or perception. This would be a different plane of memory. Therefore, if we imagine the point M on the board, we must imagine a plane perpendicular to the board. A circle on a plane perpendicular to the board. I acknowledge that many memories are indeed acquired this way. Many memories are acquired through the repetition of an impression. These are learned things, learned by heart. And I believe these are the most useful memories for a very simple reason. When we take the time to learn something by heart, it is because we need to know it. Therefore, what we learn by heart is generally something useful, which is why it stands out, why we pay attention to it. Additionally, these are the easiest memories to recall. A thing learned by heart is the one whose memory can most easily be evoked. We take the term learned by heart in its broadest sense, learned by repetition. But just because these learned memories, those acquired through repetition, are practically the most useful and the easiest to evoke, it does not at all follow that they are the most numerous. On the contrary, upon closer examination, we realize that these memories are exceptional. They are the exception in our psychological life, and the vast majority of our memories, nearly all of them, correspond to impressions that occurred only once in our past history and were not repeated. The very nature of events is that they have a date, that they happened once and were not repeated. In fact, if something is repeated, it ceases to be an event. By event, I mean both the most trivial details of our history and significant incidents. Thus, all of our past, which resides in our memory, remains there due to impressions that each occurred only once. The memories acquired through repetition, the habits, the memories that are observed and studied in classical psychology, these memories are entirely exceptional. They are, I repeat, the most useful, the most important, and the easiest to recall, but they are by far the least numerous. Now, if we compare these memories, what I will call habit memories, acquired through repetition, with memories that are not habits, which correspond to impressions experienced only once, we see that these are two entirely different things. The nature of memories acquired through repetition is that as they become more perfected, they become more and more motoric, tending more and more toward motor tendencies, toward being enacted rather than represented. The better you know a poem by heart, for example, the more it tends to be recited automatically, to become movements. In the end, the more these habit memories are perfected, the more they tend to be enacted rather than represented. It is action, as I said. On the other hand, memories that correspond to impressions, experienced only once, become more vivid and clearer in our minds, especially in states of reverie or in pathological conditions. Thus, they move us away from simple images, from pure representations. The memories I call habit memories are memories that, by their very origin and mode of acquisition, are not tied to the past. They do not evoke the idea of the past. They are, as I said, oriented toward the future rather than the past. They are tendencies ingrained in our bodies, movements executed or just beginning. These memories lean toward the future. A being with no concept of the past could still have these memories, could carry in their mind countless lessons learned by heart and recite them, unaware that there is a past, yet still utilizing that past through these habits which exist solely for that purpose. By contrast, the first type of memories, those corresponding to an impression experienced only once, exist solely by virtue of the past. One must ascend into the past with an effort that is almost the reverse of the effort needed to act. To bring to mind all these memories, I call Type 3 memories. These memories are directed in the opposite way from the previous ones. The former are oriented toward action, the latter are directed toward what I would call reverie. I referred to this plane as RR prime, the plane of reverie. I use the word figuratively, but the more we dream, the closer we get to the state of reverie, the more we recall these memories. On the other hand, the closer we approach the top, the further we move away from the state of reverie and toward what I would call the plane of action, the plane of movement. At M, that is the name I gave this point. At M, movement and action must be localized, while at R prime, it is reverie. This is how I would broadly represent things, but we would need to elaborate and clarify certain elements. What are the relations between the planes we have just distinguished, and how should we represent the overall mechanism of memory? Let me give an outline of the representation I have arrived at. I won't have time to fully justify this representation today, but I will say this. At point M, as I mentioned earlier, we must imagine action, movements that contract the past within them. A being located only at M, for whom the rest of the cone did not exist, would, in a sense, play out their past experience. They would not represent it. Animals are in this position, and we ourselves are like animals in many of our actions and psychological states. Thus, at M, there would be movement, action, and nothing but action. On the other hand, if we represent the plane RR', on this plane, there is no action. There is only the representation of the past for its own sake. What is reverie? It is a state that is likely never fully realized in humans, just as the state M is never fully realized. M and RR are the two extreme limits, and our conscious life generally unfolds between these two extremes, and should be represented at any given moment by a certain cross-section of the cone, either closer to the tip or closer to the base of the cone. How does this cross-section occur? How is it made known? Psychological life consists of placing oneself at a certain point, at a certain height, between this ideal tip and this ideal base of the cone. Here is how I represent things. We must imagine that personal memories of the past, memories that are likely to be indefinitely, perhaps infinitely numerous. I do not claim that all of the past is preserved, although it is possible. It is quite possible that nothing of our past is lost, that nothing is forgotten, and that forgetting is only apparent. This cannot be precisely demonstrated, although we can enumerate facts and arguments that would support this thesis. But for our present purpose, we do not need to go that far. It suffices to admit that on this extreme plane of memory, which we have called RR', there are far more things than we will ever recall in our lifetime. There are countless memories in a virtual state that will never be actualized, but they could perhaps be actualized in pathological states. We know, indeed, that in pathological states, a multitude of things return to memory that were believed to be completely forgotten and would have remained forgotten if these pathological states had not occurred. Thus, it suffices to admit that on this extreme plane of memory, on this RR base, there exists, in an unconscious or virtual state, an enormous, incalculable number of memories. We must imagine these memories situated on this base RR' as pressing forward, exerting a sort of constant pressure on consciousness to emerge from the shadows into full light. They are, in a way, ghosts seeking to materialize. At the tip of the cone, at point M, there is movement. We could say, life, there is the flesh and blood that constitute life. But on the plane RR', there are ghosts. These ghosts wish to borrow the flesh and blood found at point M in order to become living beings. There is, among all these memories, a kind of competition in the darkness, a forward thrust. Which of these virtual memories will become actual? Which of these ghosts will manage to materialize? It will be those most similar to the present perception, those that can best insert themselves into it, and those that best align with the movement we are currently sketching. In short, it will be the memories that best fit with our current perception. Therefore, all these personal memories, occupying the extreme plane of memory, are there in a ghost-like state, pushing forward, but only a small number of them will reach consciousness. Only those that are useful to consciousness will make the transition from virtuality to actuality. That is to say, only those memories that can illuminate the present situation by their resemblance to it will emerge into consciousness. After all, the major question at any moment is to know what we should do, how we should proceed, and how to make the most of the current situation. The only way to do this is to refer to a similar situation from the past, to know what preceded it and especially what followed it, for only then can we know what to do. Therefore, we can anticipate that the memories best selected from among all those vying for actualization will be the ones that have some resemblance to the present, specifically in terms of the action currently being carried out. It is not resemblance in general that matters. General resemblance means nothing. Everything resembles everything else. What matters is resemblance in terms of the action being performed. In addition to the memories resembling the present situation, there are memories of events and objects that were once contiguous to similar memories, such that through the juxtaposition of these contiguous elements, we understand what came before, and most importantly, what followed. Therefore, these personal memories move forward, and as they do, they contract. This extreme circle contracts as it moves toward the tip of the cone, and in this process, different memories mix. A multitude of similar yet personal memories overlap and interfere with one another, becoming depersonalized, turning into impersonal memories. Through the contraction of this extreme circle, R'Im, we get the circle SS', composed of impersonal images obtained by the interference of personal memories. This circle SS itself continues to contract as we move further toward action, toward living our memories rather than merely recalling them. Thus, in humans, it is likely that memories emerge from the depths of intelligence, from the depths of virtual personal memory with temporal localization. These memories, emerging from the depths, join together and interfere with one another, giving rise to impersonal images and schemas. This movement from virtual memory to actual memory is entirely explained by the pull of action, the necessity of acting.